Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee, our resident storyteller, historian, and host. And you might have guessed there's something sitting on my lap here. I love maps, and this particular map is a treasure in its own right. Who is the cartographer in this case, Bill?
Cartographer is George Mercer Dawson. Completed the map in 1895, almost a century ago, Mike. And it shows what I consider one of the finest parts of British Columbia, no doubt about it. And if you start at Kamloops, most people know where Kamloops is, then go down Kamloops Lake. We're not talking about the North Thompson or the South Thompson River. We're talking about the main Thompson. Main Thompson starts at Savannah and goes down past Dead Man's Bend, past the Bonaparte, past some old Indian villages down here, and you go all the way downriver to a little place called Spence's Bridge. Then you go past the Nickaman, then right down to Lytton, where the Thompson runs into the Fraser. And this is really the arid country. The Thompson, of course, was named after David Thompson, who was also a magnificent cartographer, one of the great map makers who preceded Dawson. And Thompson, interesting enough, the Indians called him Kukusint, which means man who watches stars or looks at stars. And he was a Northwest Company explorer and also a Northwest Company map maker. He had never been on this particular river, but because he was so gifted, they named the river after him.
Is that right? Thompson never was on the Thompson River?
No, and this Thompson River, Mike, is really the arid. This is the desert country of British Columbia in many respects. It's up in that, what we call the northern part of the Great American Desert. So this is a river in the blue cutting through the desert country. This is really the Old West.
When I take a look at this map, the work that Dawson and McElvoy and his various people that he had working under him did, I could take that map, and as I take a look at the gradations and the shading and everything, this map takes me right to the spot. The country just sort of comes out of this map.
Remarkable. Despite a physical infirmity, he crawled all these hills. He did a marvelous job, and this map, in a century, Mike, is virtually unchanged.
Okay. Coming back to the ribbon of blue in the desert, the main Thompson River between Kamloops Lake and the Fraser River. We'll do that story and some of the places there right after these words. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee. We're talking about the Thompson River country from really Kamloops Lake down to the Lytton area. We'll get more specific as time goes by, but I'm amazed at the population prior to any white arrival of Indian people in this area.
Yeah, really quite remarkable. Of course, this was a great fishing river. You know, the salmon came up the Fraser and then went up the Thompson and went up farther up the Thompson, South Thompson, specifically up towards the Adams Lake area. And this was area they could make their living quite easily, Mike. And they were very powerful. And here this particular photograph indicates two of the Thompson warriors around probably the 1880s in full regalia. And they were very truculent, didn't like the whites, especially at that time, certainly after the whites had arrived. And here's another shot that I think is very indicative. This is a shot of an Indian burial on the Fraser River itself, very close to the Thompson, of course. And it shows the burial of a small child and all the treasured items this child would have carried into the land beyond, or the land of shades.
There's a pair of scissors in here.
Yeah.
And these are all the things that were that person's possessions.
Sure. And even today, you can go along various of the old Indian campsites on the Thompson River, and you will find lots of artifacts from those years, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And of course, Lena Shaw at Shaw Springs had thousands of artifacts. I've picked up hundreds of artifacts on both the South Thompson and the main Thompson.
Now, these are some arrowheads. These are arrowheads that you picked up on the Thompson.
On the Thompson, yeah, and the South Thompson.
These look, I mean, so perfect as to be, you know, sort of replicas, but these are the real McCoy.
Yeah, they were artisans, and they picked different types of stone to work with, obsidian sometimes, and a chert and a basalt and various other types of, and really had a very, very severe cutting edge.
Yeah. These are still sharp.
Oh, sure they are.
Well, would these have just been lost in the hunt, washed up on shore?
Yeah.
Because they look good enough. They
Usually washed up below the Indian village. The river works over that sand and brings them up because they're flat, brings them up to the shore, and people go along and hunt them, Mike.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's really quite an interesting area. And in Spence's Bridge itself, of course, there was one of the famous individuals, interpreters of Indian history, James Tate. And James Tate is well known to individuals all across North America. He was the individual who spoke 4 or 5 different Indian languages. The Indians called him good looking. They thought he was good looking. And here's a picture of James Tate with one of his Indian wives. And they would have indicated in High Plains language something like this, which means nice face. And he indeed has a nice face.
That's how they would have described Tate.
Yeah, indeed.
How come they liked him and not the other European white arrivals?
Well, Tate really was the individual who faded in with the Indian society. He lived with some Indian women. He was married to several different. He spoke their languages extremely well. He was fascinated by their customs. So Tate was one of theirs. They really assumed he was one of theirs.
Did he act in any way as an intermediary between the other whites that arrived, or?
Yes, he softened that transition, of course. But the transition, by the way, really started probably in 1852. It's 52 to 55. It's debatable whether where the first gold was found. It was probably found at Nicomen. Some people will say it was found at Tranquille Creek, both in the same area, by the way, Mike. And so we'll say the early 1850s, and small groups of white miners, mostly from Washington Territory, California, and Oregon, started drifting across the British line and up the Fraser River or through the Okanagan route and into the Thompson area. And and by the way, they ran the gauntlet in Washington Territory in about 1858.
Ran the gauntlet.
Yeah, they ran the gauntlet. Kamayakin, the frontier was ablaze, and Kamayakin was a great chief. He was resisting the white invasion of traditional Indian territory, and really quite fascinating. Well, they came onto the Fraser, some went straight up the Fraser, Mike, and some branched off towards the east, up the Thompson. And they thought they were on the right river. There were nuggets on the Thompson around Dead Man's Bend and so on, up to 2 ounces in weight. Very, very coarse gold in certain parts of the Thompson, which is quite interesting. But by 1860, the magnificent diggings in the Cariboo country had been discovered, Mike, and they drift off the river. But here you see a shot that indicates what probably took place in that particular area. Here's a rocker right on the river, well placed, because the big boulders are there. Where the big boulders start stacking up, usually the gold is coarser.
So you go just under the back of those boulders, and that's
right,
where you're finding some stuff.
That's correct. And so this is what happened. And after they drift, the main body of white miners went into the Cariboo. A few Chinese and a few Indians stayed right on the river. But that was only really the first phase.
Because I guess this area, I mean, miners are like this, placer miners especially.
Sure.
They may even find gold, but if somebody says there's more gold somewhere else, they'll leave what they have to try and find something else.
No doubt about it, Mike. And what happened, of course, is they had to have a road into the diggings. The first Cariboo Road wasn't the right road. So now they start constructing a second road from Old Yale, and they go up to Lytton, and then they branch up the main Thompson. And as they branch up the main Thompson, they have to cross over to the north bank. And there they establish a place called Cook's Ferry. Cook was the original individual who settled there and has a ferry going across the river transporting men and equipment and goods north so they can get into the Cariboo. This is replaced, by the way. You can see this particular shot of some of the equipment ready to go across the river, but Cook's Ferry is replaced by a guy who comes in, and his name is John Spence. He builds a bridge there, and here's John Spence's bridge, taken by Daly probably in 1867, and here's John Spence's bridge, and it's quickly shortened from John Spence's bridge to Spence's Bridge.
Now, this looked like a huge structure. I mean, it had to cross a major river. It had to, and it had several spans involved in it, and it must have cost a fair buck. How did he manage to do this?
Well, of course, you know, he was a toll bridge, you see, and his first toll keeper was a guy called John Murray. And invariably, his strange quirk of fate, but most of the toll keepers did very, very well. Perhaps they were poor at counting, or perhaps they kept a portion of it. I'm not about to say what Murray did, but I do know that he did extremely well. And on that road, of course, there were numerous other places. There was 80 Mile House, which was 80 miles up from Yale, so that's why it was called 80 Mile House. And the Cariboo Road looked like this. And we've used this shot once before, Mike, and I think it's one of the great shots of the Old West. Here's a wagon coming through, and they're coming through a place which a lot of people know as the Great Bluff. But originally it was called Hell's Gate.
I thought Hell's Gate was the canyon on the Fraser River where it was so turbulent there.
That is a Hell's Gate. But this is the first Hell's Gate. That one was the second Hell's Gate.
So this was Hell's Gate to the Cariboo Road or something?
Yeah,
That would be the way to
sure,
put it?
Sure.
They thought it was hell up there, did they?
Well, it was barren country. You make one slip, you're down into eternity. You're in the river, hundreds and hundreds of feet below. And this was the lifeline into Spence's Bridge. And what happens in Spence's Bridge is rather interesting. When the Cariboo Road comes through, the hotels start to spring up. You know, there's a Spence's Bridge Hotel, and there's Murray's Hotel, and there's the Hermitage. By the way, here's a marvelous shot of the Hermitage. Stagecoach stopping in front of the Hermitage, and on its way, probably, it looks like it's on its way downriver along the old Cariboo Road.
It's basically a way station. This is a stop along the Cariboo Road where you take on more provisions, the horses get a chance to rest, and it just happened to be one of the bigger spots.
Yeah, and at this time, probably, this is a shot probably taken about the 1880s, Mike, and they're shooting from across the south side of the river across into Spence's Bridge. And you can see half a dozen buildings there. And of course, they had several hotels, as I mentioned. They had a drugstore. They had a number of other places of business.
You've got a drugstore thing here. I want to have a
that's
look
a
at
beauty.
it. This is, I'll put my arrowheads down and pick up my drugstore material. Look at W.E. McCarthy and Bro, Chemists and Druggists, Yale, and Spence's Bridge. So it actually got preserved in glass at least.
Yeah. Very few of those bottles, Mike. I think 4 in B.C. I happen to have one. Got it off an very old, dear friend of mine called August and Claire Milliken, whom we've mentioned before on the program. And really, when they came in, they probably came in when the next great savior of the economy of Spence's Bridge came in, and the railroad started coming in 1884.
It's always the railroad.
Sure. Preceded by the Chinese, who were the work gangs on the railroad, and Anderon and Dunk and all the bosses, and they were driving up the canyon, and the railroad comes in. This, of course, is the mighty CPR, later to be followed by the CNR. And the railroad adds a few more hotels, because some people are working in Spence's Bridge, and Spence's Bridge does fairly well for a few years. But then something else happens, Mike, and this is a catastrophe. It's the great avalanche of August the 13th, 1905.
An avalanche you usually think of as being snow-oriented, but this is a huge landslide.
This is a landslide almost without equal, I would think, in the history of the Fraser River country, with one possible exception. And what happened was this. Here's a picture of Murray Creek.
Murray, this is the same guy who was the toll bridge operator?
Yeah, this is the guy who owned most of Spence's Bridge at that particular time.
So he's got a creek named after him.
Yeah, right. They named the creek after him. The creek is responsible for the catastrophe. And here you look at the creek. Here are the falls of Murray Creek Falls coming over. Down at the bottom of the falls are 2 individuals. Now, what happened? There's a great volume of water pouring through these falls, and it starts to undercut the mountain. Now, down unsuspecting, down in Spence's Bridge, it's a Sunday. People are going about their Sunday. It's a day of rest. They're not too concerned. Some are going swimming, some are going for a walk, and so on. On the far side of the river, on the south side, the Indians, most of them have gone to church. And rather interesting aside here, because the 2 Smith kids of the widow Smith, and they jump on their horse. They're going to go down to the river. They've gone down to the river hundreds of times on this horse. So they jump on the horse, and the horse is very, very steady, and he starts galloping down towards the river, and suddenly he puts on the brakes and starts backing up. They're amazed. They look for a snake. No rattlesnake there. So they wonder, and they try to urge the horse on. The horse isn't going anywhere. Then they hear a horrific roar, and the whole mountain just collapses. Comes right across the river, blocks off the Thompson, goes across into the Indian village. Most of the people weren't there. Kills 18 Indians immediately, and injures probably several dozen more who are just able to get out of the way. Most of them in church, of course, do survive. And this is a catastrophe of magnificent proportions.
So this obviously blocks the Thompson River for how long a time?
Blocks the Thompson for 4 hours. It starts to back up and starts actually to threaten both the Indian village and Spence's Bridge itself. But finally it finds it as an outlet, and it breaks through. So this is kind of a forerunner, an indicator, foreshadowing of what is happening, because this town now starts to decline slightly.
Just because of the sort of the specter of this disaster.
Yeah, along with other economic pressures, Mike.
Oh, what a fortunate thing. God's intervention, I guess, in some way in getting the native community in the church.
Yeah.
Okay. Take a break here. Come back in just a second, and there is more to know about Spence's Bridge in this area, and we'll do that right after we come back from these words. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Old Spence's Bridge just narrowly avoids disaster, but it can't avoid just a lack of interest anymore.
Yeah, the decline. The railroad's still running by, Mike. It's still a whistle stop, but not a lot of people are making a good living. Some of the whites try to go to orcharding or try their hand at ranching. The Indians fall back on the river generally, and they start going prospecting again to make a stake. And this particular photograph is very interesting. Here on the right-hand side of the photograph, you'll see the Thompson coming under that bridge on the right-hand side. This is where it joins the Fraser, right at Lytton. The Indians are down there with about 5 or 6 different rocker boxes, and the whole family goes down there. They're prospecting, the kids take part in it, and they do quite well. The Indian prospectors and placer gold miners of that era are good placer gold miners. And the next photograph, I think, is...
This is the family shot, right?
Well, sure
This is a great picture.
It's a marvelous picture, very, very clear, and they're on their way prospecting, and they're probably doing both. Certainly the gold pan, the old trusty gold pan,
There it is.
there, right at the right-hand side, and they're on their way either prospecting for placer gold or they're prospecting for copper, gold, or silver lode. And this is so the family's there again, father, some of the kids, everybody's there, and they're out on their own.
So the white men may come and go, but the native people who called that area home for the millennium are still there, and they've picked up a little on the European pastime.
You bet, and they're good prospectors.
Now, this industrial strength-looking chisel is associated with an interesting story. What do you use a tool like this
Well,
for in the first
that's
place?
a bridge shaping tool. It shapes the timbers on a bridge. It's called a slick, and they would have undoubtedly used this on Spence's Bridge, which reminded me of a story, Mike, and I think it's a story worth relating. Spence's Bridge, like all those toll bridges, they were used a lot, especially when the Cariboo Road was busy, and they had to once in a while take off the top timbering. That is,
They get worn down, and you replace them with a few more big timbers.
Yeah, it left only the stringers on the bridge. And the stringers were fairly wide, but, you know, something we had to be very careful at. Well, one night they'd taken all these off, hadn't blocked off the bridge, so only the stringers are left.
These are the ones that go lengthwise. These are the ones that
go across the river. That's right. You lay the planks over top of them. They'd
2
be
feet
maybe
wide?
Yeah, maybe 2 feet wide, maybe. And so an unsuspecting mule driver comes up from the south. He goes through the Indian village. Nobody tells him anything. Nobody knows. It's late at night, and it's a pitch black night. The mules know their way. So he's just following the mules, hanging onto the line, you know, and he's going across. He comes to the bridge, and you can hear the water going, and he's going across the bridge, and he goes right across to the other side. He goes to one of the hotels, sits down and has a drink, and one of the guys says, "Where'd you come from, the Cariboo?" No, he says, I just came up from Lytton. What do you mean, how'd you come up from Lytton? The guy says, as everybody leans forward. Well, the guy says, across the bridge. What do you think? You crossed the bridge? Oh, there are no planks on the bridge. And the guy goes white as a sheet. You're kidding me. He thought they were pulling his leg. They grab a lantern, light up the lantern, go down to the bridge, and there they're only the stringers. And the guy says, I wouldn't have done that in the daytime, he said.
Yeah.
So the mules, of course, being sure-footed, went right across that bridge. He follows them dead across the bridge on the stringer.
And that's a long bridge, and remembering that shot, it's 30 feet in the air.
Oh, yeah, he's dead man if he goes down. Certainly. In the pitch black, he'd go down, he'd stay down.
And what a wonderful story to be recollected by. What did you call this tool?
That's a slick.
A slick.
Yeah.
And it just basically takes round beams
Sure.
and makes them flat for that purpose.
Yeah.
You've got another story which
I've got another
dates
story,
back
yeah.
into the 50s.
Yeah, it does.
This is a neat story, and it's associated, as a matter of fact, with this gold piece.
Yes, Mike, we go back to 1957, which is a few years ago. And some time ago, months and months ago, I was discussing the Spence's Bridge country with a guy called Walter Cook, who now lives in Osoyoos. And Walter says, I have an interesting story, and an interesting story it is, Mike. In 1957, Dawson Wade, which is a big construction company in British Columbia, is working on the Trans-Canada Highway near Nikomin. And that's probably where the original discovery took place. And this photograph we see now is Nikomin as it appeared in the early years. This is where this story takes shape. So he's standing there with a bunch of other men, and they're watching the cats at work, the bulldozers and the scrapers and everything else. And one of the big scrapers comes down this partly finished road, and he takes a big gouge out of a big cut out of the bank, and he starts to pull away, and they see something white cascading down the bank. And what comes down the bank looks like a skull. One of the workers runs out, he grabs this, and it is a skull, completely bleached, and he looks at it, and then Walter Cook, he looks at the bank, and he sees a glint of what he thinks is gold in the bank. He runs up and he pulls out a gold coin, a big $20 gold piece. He looks at the date and he thinks it was 1850s, which really makes the story very,
This is
very
important, eh?
Very important. And So what happens is Cook puts the gold coin in his pocket after looking at it. The other guy looks at the skull. Notice there's a big crease in the skull, a dent, probably the reason for this individual's demise. And one of the bosses comes down, a guy called George Richardson. He looks at the skull and says, that looks interesting. He said, do you mind if I have that skull? The guy says, no, go ahead. Gives it to Richardson. Richardson eventually sends it to the UBC, University of British Columbia. And they send back a report. And I think the report indicated, and Cook can't remember precisely, but this is the skull of a white man who was indeed killed by a blow to the head. And the reason they know it was a white man because the teeth were not worn down as the Indian teeth of that era were from chewing leather and so on. So white man was killed, blow to the head, and they interred him with some gold coins. Whether there was one, whether there were a number, we don't know. Whether it was a white trader coming on the way through, we'll never know, because all of these...
All the evidence is now part of the base of this Trans-Canada Highway.
Is under the Trans-Canada Highway. But this isn't the end of the story. And as they filled in on the Trans-Canada Highway, a lot of the gravel spilled over into the Thompson River. And an Indian drifts up, and he comes up, his name is Adams. That's all I can remember. He's deceased now. He comes up from Lytton. He's an old prospector and a good prospector. He looks over this scene for a while and he says, that's interesting. And he goes down below a wall they just constructed where there's a bit of a back eddy, Mike. He starts panning down there. He stays at it every day, Saturdays and Sundays, day in and day out, continually. He fills up pill bottles full of gold, a lot of it coarse gold. And remember, there is coarse gold in this area. Yeah. There was nuggets up to 2 ounces. A lot of coarse gold came out of the Nickerman originally. And so he fills up pokes full of gold, pill bottles full of gold. These guys, the construction guys, catch on. They start going up the bank, and they start panning gold, and they do quite well, too. So really, this area may indeed, Mike, have a high run. I'm inclined to think it is. I think there's a high run somewhere around Old Nickerman Creek.
Now, would this, the fact that there was gold found in conjunction with a human, with a Caucasian European body, that would indicate that it wasn't robbery that was the motivation for his demise. What would have been the reason for that guy's demise? Any observations?
Well, I think he was trespassing on Thompson territory. They didn't like the whites in that area, and they decided to get rid of one. And they probably got rid of more than one. That may have been 1859 or 1858, when there were a lot of troubles on the Thompson and on the Fraser.
But now in 1957, these guys, I mean the road crew and the Indian prospector all find it. Are you indicating that you think that there's still a high run and that the gold hasn't been pulled out of there?
You can still go along the Thompson River, and if you're a good prospector, Mike, you can still find fairly coarse gold on various parts of the Thompson.
Yeah, because the Thompson is not famous for its gold, right? The Fraser bars, and then the Thompson's certainly secondary.
I think the Thompson today is a better river for panning than the Fraser is today.
Not as much attention to it.
More chance to find a high run.
Now, when I talk about a high run, are you looking now up 100 feet from the river, or what are you doing?
Might be 300 feet from the river, might be 30 feet from the river, Mike. Very hard to tell. Okay. Lots of bedrock, should be looked at.
So there could be a treasure story yet on the Thompson River. We've been looking at that area of the Thompson from Savanaugh, just at the western end of Kamloops Lake, down to Lytton, mentioning a couple of places like Spence's Bridge, and thank you for joining us today. We'll be back again next time with more Gold Trails and Ghost Town stories.